Her husband left her for a younger woman, laughing at her misfortune. She made a move that changed everything. The notification came while she was wiping down the kitchen counter, the rhythmic motion of the cloth against the marble giving her a rare moment of quiet. Her phone buzzed, and she absent-mindedly reached for it, expecting it to be a message from the boutique supplier about the new shipment of handbags. Instead, it was from her husband. "I'm leaving you. I've found someone younger, someone who actually makes me happy. Don't bother calling, I'm already gone. Oh, and by the way, I cleaned out our joint account. Good luck." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the words blurring before her eyes. Her hands tightened around the phone, but not from shock. This wasn't a surprise. It was simply confirmation of what she had suspected for months. The late nights at work that never matched his pay stubs. The gym membership he suddenly cared about, the new cologne he had never worn for her. The secretive phone calls in the middle of the night, the way his laptop screen would darken when she walked by. It all made sense now. The betrayal wasn't the hardest part, it was the sheer arrogance, the way he truly believed she would crumble, that she would be helpless without him. She placed the phone down, taking a slow breath. Her fingers did not shake, her pulse did not race. Instead, a calm determination settled over her. She had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it in ways he could never imagine. As she turned away from the counter, her gaze landed on the framed wedding photo on the fireplace mantel. They had been so different back then, she, a hopeful young woman building her dream business, and he, the charming man who had promised to support her. Now, years later, he was nothing more than a shadow of the man she once loved, chasing youth and illusions. She picked up the frame, studied it for a moment, then placed it face down. There was no sadness in her, only the quiet acceptance that her life was about to change, and not in the way he expected. Sitting at her desk, she logged into their shared bank account, already knowing what she would find. The balance read $0, followed by a string of withdrawal transactions made just that morning. He had been thorough, ensuring not a cent remained. A mocking smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. How predictable. He truly thought he had one. She clicked out of the page and logged into her private account, the one she had started funneling money into the moment she noticed his late-night absences. The numbers there were far from empty. Months ago, she had consulted with an attorney, not because she had definitive proof, but because her instincts had screamed that something was wrong. That attorney had advised her to take precautions, and she had done so meticulously. Every financial record, every suspicious transaction he had made, every careless mistake, she had documented them all. And now, as she stared at the evidence neatly arranged in folders on her laptop, a single thought echoed in her mind. He has no idea what's coming. The phone buzzed again. Another message from him. I know this must be hard for you. But let's be honest, you're not exactly young anymore. At least you still have your little shop. Maybe you'll find someone your own age who doesn't mind that you've let yourself go. She let out a breathless laugh, the audacity of it almost amusing. Little shop. If only he knew. Her boutique, the one he had scoffed at as a hobby, was far more successful than he had ever cared to realize. She had intentionally kept its financials separate from their joint assets, knowing he never paid attention to the details. While he spent his money trying to impress younger women, she had been expanding, securing investments, and building something of real value. And now, the man who had just thrown her aside was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating the wrong woman. The first real warning sign had come 6 months ago, though at the time, she hadn't wanted to believe it. A charge on their credit card for an upscale restaurant on a night he had claimed to be working late had caught her attention. It wasn't just the expense that stood out, but the fact that it was for a table for two. When she asked him about it casually, he had waved it off with a rehearsed chuckle, muttering something about a work dinner. But his eyes had flickered, just for a second. That was all she needed. She had always been observant, the kind of woman who noticed when someone hesitated before a lie. That night, she hadn't argued. She had simply taken note. From that moment on, the discrepancies started piling up. Late nights at the office that never matched his paycheck deposits, sudden interest in his appearance, expensive cologne, a gym membership he actually used, clothes that didn't fit his usual style. Then there were the phone habits, the way his screen would dim the second she walked into the room, how his laughter over text messages seemed meant for someone else. He thought she was naive, too preoccupied with her boutique to notice the subtle shifts. But she had noticed everything. And while most women might have confronted him outright, demanding explanations, she had done something far more effective. She had started planning. When he had suggested merging their finances a few months ago, calling it a practical step in marriage, she had smiled and agreed without hesitation. He had no idea that, just days earlier, she had opened a separate account under her own name, transferring her savings bit by bit. She knew he would check their joint balance occasionally, so she left just enough in it to keep up appearances. Meanwhile, every dime she truly valued was placed beyond his reach. If he was preparing to betray her, she would make sure he walked away with nothing more than his arrogance. The moment she found a hotel receipt in his pocket, one that proved, without a doubt, that he had spent the night with someone else, she knew she had made the right choice. There was no confrontation, no tears, no accusations. Instead, she had calmly taken photos of the receipt, placed it back where she found it, and continued with her day as though nothing had changed. She wasn't a fool. She knew confronting him then would only lead to lies and excuses. Instead, she focused on solidifying her escape plan. If he wanted to play games, he was about to realize she was 10 steps ahead. Their joint account, the one he had smugly emptied that morning, had never been her real source of security. She had moved her earnings, her investments, and even the boutique's liquid assets into a separate banking institution months ago. He had drained the money, thinking he had left her stranded, but he was completely unaware that she had enough funds tucked away to rebuild her life twice over. The irony made her smile. He had stolen from an illusion, leaving behind the real treasure untouched. But money wasn't the only thing she had safeguarded. She had also gathered every bit of proof of his infidelity, hotel receipts, credit card statements, and even screenshots of the flirtatious messages he thought he had deleted. All neatly filed and ready for the day she would need them. He believed he had one, that he had escaped consequence-free. Soon, he would understand just how wrong he was. Her fingers barely hesitated as she dialed the number she had saved under a simple name, legal consultant. The woman on the other end picked up after the first ring. "He made his move," she said, keeping her voice steady. There was a brief pause before the attorney responded, "Good. That means we can make ours." 2 months ago, when she had first consulted with the lawyer, she had been uncertain. She had walked into that office still harboring a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, her suspicions were wrong. That he was just going through a phase. But that hope had been crushed beneath cold, hard evidence. And so, she had done what any intelligent woman would do. She had prepared. Her lawyer had advised her on every step, how to move her money discreetly, how to document his misdeeds, how to ensure that when the time came, she would hold all the power. Now, that time had arrived. What he didn't realize was that financial deception in a marriage, especially when it involved draining shared accounts for personal use, wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. And given that she had carefully documented every transaction, every unauthorized withdrawal, and even his text messages bragging about the money he had taken, he had unknowingly built the case against himself. The moment he had pressed withdraw on their joint savings, he had committed financial fraud. Her attorney had already drafted the necessary filings. By the time he was settling into his new life with his younger mistress, the court would be preparing to freeze any assets he had left. His triumphant escape would turn into a nightmare before he even had time to celebrate. She walked into his workplace with quiet confidence, ignoring the receptionist's questioning glance as she strode toward his office. He was mid-laugh when he saw her, probably joking about his newfound freedom with a colleague. His expression shifted from amusement to arrogance, the smirk she had once adored now a twisted mockery of the man she used to love. "You here to beg?" he asked, leaning back in his chair with an air of superiority. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to consider it. Then, she smiled, a smile that made his confidence waver just slightly. "Oh, not at all," she said smoothly. "I just wanted to see your face one last time before everything changes." He frowned, but before he could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him staring after her, uncertain for the first time. That afternoon, his world began to unravel. The first sign was the hotel manager calling to inform him that his reservation had been canceled due to a payment dispute. Then came the notification from his bank, alerting him that his credit cards were temporarily frozen due to fraudulent activity flagged under his name. Confused, he tried calling the bank, only to learn that his access to their former joint account had been revoked under legal order. The final blow came when his company's legal department informed him that his personal financial issues were being reviewed, a polite way of saying that his reckless actions were now a professional liability. His phone buzzed once more, and this time, it was her name on the screen. His heart pounded in irritation as he answered. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded. There was a pause, then her voice, calm, controlled, and carrying an edge of amusement. "I told you," she said. "Everything is about to change." Then, she hung up. His frustration mounted as he scrolled through the bank's automated messages, each one colder than the last. Suspicious activity detected. Temporary hold placed on account. Please contact our fraud department. He cursed under his breath, gripping the edge of the hotel's check-in desk. Melissa, his fresh-faced, doe-eyed girlfriend, looked up from her phone, confused. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight whine of entitlement. He exhaled sharply, trying to suppress the anger boiling under his skin. "It's nothing," he muttered. But it wasn't nothing, his credit cards were locked, and the account he had so confidently drained was now inaccessible. Worse yet, the hotel receptionist was giving him a look that was growing more impatient by the second. "Sir, I'm afraid your card isn't going through," the woman behind the desk said, her polite professionalism failing to mask the skepticism in her eyes. He forced a laugh, pretending to be unbothered. "That's impossible," he said, pulling out another card. The second attempt failed. So did the third. A tightness gripped his chest as realization set in. He turned toward Melissa, expecting sympathy, but instead, he found her frowning. "Mark, are you broke?" she asked, half joking. But he could hear the edge in her voice, the first sign of doubt. He clenched his jaw, shoving his wallet back into his pocket. "It's just a banking error," he lied. "We'll go somewhere else." But as they left the lobby, suitcase wheels rattling behind them, he could feel the walls closing in. This was not just a banking error. This was her. The ride to the motel was silent, save for Melissa's occasional sighs of irritation as she scrolled through her phone. She had been excited for a luxury vacation, a carefree escape funded by his newfound freedom. Instead, she was now sitting in the backseat of a rideshare, staring at budget accommodation options. He tried calling his bank, but the automated system only confirmed his worst fears. Due to a recent legal inquiry, your account has been placed on hold. Please contact our fraud department for further details. Legal inquiry. Those words sent a chill down his spine. Fumbling, he called his personal bank manager, the one who had always smoothed over his financial missteps. "Hey, it's Mark," he said, forcing a casual tone. "Listen, I'm having some issues with my account. Just a mix-up, I'm sure." The pause on the other end told him everything. "Mr. Reynolds," the banker finally responded, voice stiff with hesitation. "We've received a court order regarding your assets. I'm afraid I can't disclose details," but Mark's grip tightened on his phone. "You can't be serious. Who filed it?" He already knew the answer. He just needed to hear it. Another pause. Then, finally, "Your wife." Melissa stared at him as he hung up, her brows knit together. "What's going on?" she asked, her patience wearing thin. "Nothing," he snapped, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. The motel lobby smelled of cheap air freshener and desperation, the flickering fluorescent lights making the already dingy space feel suffocating. The receptionist barely looked up as she slid a key across the counter. The room was even worse, stained carpet, a flickering lamp, the unmistakable scent of mildew hanging in the air. Melissa took one look at the bed and turned to him. "You're joking, right?" He wasn't. This was all he could afford without access to his accounts. "It's temporary," he insisted. "I just need to sort out a few things." But Melissa wasn't buying it. She crossed her arms, her perfect manicure tapping against her phone case. "You promised me luxury," she said, her voice edged with irritation. "You said money wouldn't be a problem." He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of her expectation pressing down on him. He had been so sure he had left his wife ruined, left her with nothing. Instead, she was the one pulling the strings, and he was the one scrambling for control. He tried one last desperate move, booking a new hotel with the last card he had in his wallet. The receptionist took the card, swiped it, and frowned. "It's been declined." His stomach sank. He clenched his fists, inhaling sharply to keep himself from lashing out. "Try again," he said, voice strained. The receptionist complied, but the outcome was the same. Declined. Melissa huffed beside him, shifting her weight onto one hip. "So, what now?" she asked, her tone laced with frustration. For the first time, he had no answer. He pulled out his phone and tried to make another transaction, nothing. He logged into his banking app, access denied. Every door that had once been open to him was now locked shut. His wife hadn't just frozen their shared assets. She had found a way to strangle his financial independence entirely. He had laughed when he sent that text, when he drained the account, when he packed his bags and walked away. But now, as he stood there with nothing but a rejected card and a growing sense of dread, the laughter had long since died. His fingers hovered over his phone screen. He didn't want to call her, didn't want to give her the satisfaction. But as the minutes passed, the reality of his situation became unavoidable. Gritting his teeth, he pressed her contact and waited. She answered on the second ring. "Mark," she said smoothly. "Enjoying Miami?" The mockery in her tone made his blood boil. "What the hell did you do?" he growled. A soft laugh. "Oh, just tying up a few loose ends." He could hear the satisfaction in her voice, the quiet confidence of someone who knew she had one. "I have legal rights to those accounts," he snapped, though the words felt weak even as he said them. "Do you?" she mused. "Because from where I'm sitting, all I see is financial fraud. Joint accounts aren't your personal piggy bank, Mark. But I'm sure your lawyer can explain that better." His stomach twisted. He had underestimated her badly. "Fix this," he demanded, but she only sighed. "Oh, Mark," she said. "I think you're just going to have to figure this one out on your own." Then the line went dead. Mark had always taken pride in his ability to control narratives, spinning half-truths and charming his way out of trouble. But this was different. This wasn't some minor financial mishap, this was his entire life unraveling, and now, others were starting to notice. It began with hushed conversations at work, glances that lingered a little too long, colleagues whispering in the break room. By midday, the office buzzed with speculation, and Mark knew something was wrong before he even checked his email. There it was, sitting in his inbox like a ticking time bomb, a message from HR, marked urgent. He clicked it open, his pulse spiking. "Due to recent developments regarding financial discrepancies, we will be conducting an internal review. Please be available for a meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. His stomach twisted. He had never believed his personal life could affect his career, but he had underestimated how fast rumors spread. His wife had been careful, methodical. The documents she had provided to her lawyer were now being circulated in all the right places, painting him as financially reckless, untrustworthy, a liability. He had expected his family to take his side without question, to comfort him, to assure him that things would blow over. But when he called his mother, her voice was sharp with disapproval. "Mark, what have you done?" she asked, skipping the pleasantries entirely. He clenched his jaw, already exhausted from the day's events. "Mom, it's not what it looks like," he said, forcing patience into his tone. "She's exaggerating everything." But his mother wasn't convinced. "I spoke to Claire," she continued. The name sent a jolt through him. Claire, his wife, had reached out before he could twist the narrative. "She told me everything. About the accounts, the credit cards, the court order. And don't you dare tell me she's lying, Mark. I saw the paperwork." There was a long silence. Then, finally, she sighed. "I raised you better than this." The words stung more than he cared to admit. Mark had spent his entire life believing he could talk his way out of anything. So, against his better judgment, he went to see Claire in person. He arrived unannounced, knocking at the boutique's glass door just as she was closing up. She barely blinked when she saw him. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone unreadable. He hated that she looked at him like he was insignificant, like he wasn't worth the fight. "I just need a minute," he said, stepping inside before she could refuse. "Claire, this has gone too far." She crossed her arms. "Too far?" she echoed, arching an eyebrow. "You drained our account, Mark. You left me for someone half my age. You thought I'd sit back and cry while you walked away with everything." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't think you'd do this," he admitted. "You always just let things go." Her smile was cold. "And that was your biggest mistake." The first thing he noticed when he arrived back at the house was the lock. His key didn't fit. He tried again, jiggling it in frustration, but the result was the same, locked out of what was once his home. His belongings, neatly packed in boxes, sat on the front porch. A legal notice was taped to the door. He ripped it off, skimming the words quickly. "Temporary restraining order pending court proceedings. Do not attempt to enter." He staggered back, the reality hitting him like a slap. She had been thorough. He turned, scanning the street as if expecting someone to swoop in and explain that this was all a mistake. But there was no one. Just the weight of his own arrogance crushing him. Melissa pulled up in her car, her expression shifting from irritation to disbelief. "What the hell is this?" she asked, stepping out. "Where are we supposed to go?" He had no answer. Claire had played her hand masterfully. He had assumed she would drown in the aftermath of his departure, that she would be left scrambling, humiliated. Instead, he was the one with nowhere to go. He called his lawyer, hoping for some loophole, some legal technicality that would put things back in his favor. But the response was grim. "She's filed everything correctly," his attorney said, his tone almost bored. "And given the evidence of financial misconduct, the court will likely side with her." He slammed the car door shut, ignoring Melissa's growing frustration. "So what do I do?" he demanded. The lawyer sighed. "You wait. And you pray she doesn't push for more." But Mark knew better. Claire had no intention of stopping. She had spent years letting him win, letting him dictate their marriage. But now? Now, she was making sure he lost everything. The HR meeting was worse than he had anticipated. He had walked in expecting a slap on the wrist, maybe a suspension, a temporary hit to his ego. Instead, he sat across from a stone-faced panel of executives who made it clear that his presence was no longer required. "Given the public nature of your financial issues, we feel it is in the company's best interest to part ways," the HR director said, sliding a termination letter across the table. His mouth went dry. "You can't be serious." But they were. His access badge was deactivated before he even left the building. He had been discarded, just like he had discarded Claire. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be completely powerless. Melissa's patience had been wearing thin, but now it was gone entirely. She hadn't signed up for this, for cheap motels, for whispered gossip, for a boyfriend who was unemployed and locked out of his own home. "I didn't leave my old life for this," she said, arms crossed as she stared at him across the dingy motel room. "You said we'd be comfortable." He leaned against the wall, exhausted. "It's temporary." But she shook her head, already reaching for her bag. "I don't think it is." He scoffed. "What, you're leaving? Just like that?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "You left your wife the second she wasn't convenient for you. Why should I be any different?" And with that, she was gone, leaving him with nothing but the mess he had created. Mark had never truly been broke before. He had always lived with the safety net of dual incomes, credit cards, and investments he barely understood. But now, his accounts were frozen, his assets were under legal review, and every attempt to fix things only pushed him deeper into quicksand. He was drowning, and no one was coming to save him. He tried borrowing money, but no one wanted to be associated with him. Friends he had once showered with expensive dinners suddenly stopped answering his calls. The people who had once admired him now treated him like a cautionary tale. And as he sat in his car, staring at a future that no longer had a clear path, he realized the bitter truth: Claire had won. Mark had never been the kind of man to ask for help. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, the one in control. But now, with no job, no money, and no home, he had no choice. He started small, reaching out to old friends, men he had once treated to expensive dinners, covered for in sticky situations. But the responses were lukewarm at best. "Sorry, man, things are tight right now. Wish I could help, but I have my own problems." The same people who had once flocked to him when he was successful now wanted nothing to do with him. Desperation pushed him to his last resort, his family. His mother, the woman who had always supported him, now answered his calls with weary hesitation. "Mark," she sighed, after he explained his situation. "I warned you. I told you not to take Claire for granted." He ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "I don't need a lecture, Mom. I just need a place to stay for a while." The silence on the line stretched unbearably. "I love you," she finally said. "But I can't enable this. You made your choices." And just like that, the last door closed on him. He had always carried himself with confidence, always walked into a room like he owned it. But now, as he sat in his car outside a rundown diner, eating a sandwich he had barely been able to afford, he felt something he never had before: shame. He had been humiliated, discarded, stripped of everything he thought made him who he was. And the worst part? He had done it to himself. He had underestimated Claire, underestimated her strength, her intelligence. He had assumed she would break, that she would be lost without him. But she had done the opposite, she had flourished. His downfall was no longer just a quiet disaster, it had become public. Social media was filled with whispers about his situation, former colleagues, old acquaintances, even strangers commenting on how karma had finally caught up to him. He saw a post from one of Claire's boutique customers praising her for how strong she had been through everything her ex put her through. He clenched his jaw, the words stinging like salt in a wound. She was moving on, thriving, while he was drowning. He wanted to hate her for it, but deep down, he knew the truth: she wasn't the villain. He was. It took him 2 days to gather the courage to face her again. He had nothing left to lose. He arrived at her boutique in the evening, after the last customer had left. The lights inside cast a soft glow over the carefully arranged displays, the entire space exuding an air of success. She had built this, without him. As she locked the door, she turned, her expression neutral when she saw him. "Mark," she said, not surprised. "I was wondering when you'd show up." He exhaled, stepping forward. "Claire, he hesitated, the words "I need you" lodged in his throat. But she only tilted her head slightly, waiting. "I messed up," he finally admitted, his voice hoarse. "I shouldn't have left. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." He expected anger, maybe even satisfaction, but she only sighed. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, but not cruel. "This isn't my problem anymore." His chest tightened. "You don't even care?" She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "I did," she said. "A long time ago. But now? Now, I'm just glad you're not my burden anymore." She had expected to feel something, maybe triumph, maybe pity, as she watched him walk away. But as he disappeared down the street, all she felt was relief. For the first time in years, she was free. No longer weighed down by his deception, no longer tethered to his mistakes. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up, and the life she had now was entirely her own. The boutique was thriving, her finances were secure, and she was surrounded by people who respected and valued her. She locked the door, exhaling slowly. There was no lingering resentment, no bitterness. She didn't need revenge, she had already won. His downfall had never been her goal. She had simply protected herself, made smart moves, ensured that his betrayal didn't leave her in ruins. And now, standing in the life she had built for herself, she knew one thing for certain: she had never needed him. Days passed, then weeks. She barely thought of him anymore. Occasionally, a mutual acquaintance would mention his struggles in passing, but she didn't dwell on it. She had spent too much of her life making space for him in her thoughts. Now, that space was filled with bigger things: expanding her business, investing in herself, embracing the happiness she had always deserved. Then, one day, an envelope arrived at her boutique, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "You were right. I lost everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I understand now. I was a fool, and I will regret losing you for the rest of my life." She stared at the words, unmoved. She folded the note neatly, placed it in the trash, and went on with her day. Mark had never understood consequences until now. Everything he had taken for granted, everything he had so carelessly thrown away, was gone. He had no career, no support, no future prospects. The young woman he had abandoned his marriage for had left him at the first sign of struggle. His former colleagues no longer returned his calls. He had always believed he could charm his way back into success, but now he saw the truth: he wasn't as invincible as he had thought. One night, as he sat in a cheap motel, staring at the ceiling, he thought about Claire. About the life they had built together, and how he had thrown it away for an illusion. He had laughed when he left her, sure that he was trading her for something better. Now, he saw it for what it was: a mistake he could never undo. Claire never looked back. She had no interest in seeing how far he had fallen. His fate no longer concerned her, because she was too busy building her own. She had learned the most valuable lesson of all: sometimes, the best revenge isn't destruction. It's indifference. He had once believed she needed him, that she couldn't survive without him. But in the end, it was the other way around. She left work that evening, stepping into the crisp evening air, a smile playing at her lips. The life she had now was one she had built with her own strength. And that was something no one, especially Mark, could ever take away from her. As she walked down the street, head held high, she knew the truth. His betrayal had been the best thing that ever happened to her. Mark had lost everything. Claire had gained everything. And in the end, the woman he had underestimated had walked away stronger than ever.